When people talk about passive income, they usually reveal in the first 10 seconds that they have never really built any. You can hear it in the fantasy. They imagine themselves waking up late on some random Tuesday, stretching slowly, checking a phone, and smiling at the screen because money arrived while they were doing absolutely nothing. They imagine a life where labor has vanished, obligations have dissolved, and some magical portfolio has replaced the discipline of work. That picture is not just incomplete, it is dangerous because it teaches people to disrespect the part that actually matters. Passive income is not a miracle, it is a machine, and like every machine worth owning, it begins with parts. Not with glamour, it begins with amounts so small that your ego wants to laugh at them. $1 of interest, a $7 dividend, a first payment that barely covers lunch. That is how it begins. And if you are too proud for that stage, you will never reach the later one. This is why I have always believed that when people say they want passive income, what they often really want is emotional relief. They want to feel that money can arrive without the same daily stress, the same manager, the same commute, the same dependence on every paycheck being perfect. That desire is understandable, but desire without structure is how people get sold nonsense. So let me tell you the truth plainly. If I had to start over from zero and build passive income again, I would not start by searching for some secret trick. I would start by getting my active income as high as I reasonably could. That may sound like a strange first answer in a conversation about passive income, but it is the right one. Because in the beginning, the biggest lever is not your dividend yield, it is your earning power. The internet has badly damaged people's sense of financial sequence. It makes them think they should somehow be able to skip the active income phase and jump straight into the ownership phase with almost no fuel in the tank. That is backwards. Passive income is what capital does after capital exists. For most people, capital is created first by skill, work, better decisions, and the willingness to save when spending would feel easier. So if I were 20 again, or 28, or 35 and rebuilding, I would first ask a very hard question: how do I become more valuable? How do I earn more? How do I build a stronger paycheck, a stronger service, a stronger business, a stronger skill stack, a stronger ability to direct meaningful money into assets every month? That is step one, not because it sounds inspiring, because it is mathematically dominant. A man who can invest $50 a month needs hope. A man who can invest $1,000 a month needs patience. Patience is a much more reliable path than hope. That is why I would push hard on active income first. But once the engine of active income is moving, I would build passive income through 5 categories, and I would do it in an order that respects survival before optimization. The first category is high-yield cash. Now, I know that sounds boring. Good. Boring is often where intelligent financial lives begin. The purpose of high-yield cash is not to make you rich. The purpose is to stop you from becoming fragile. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A checking account is not a wealth strategy. It is a transaction hallway. Money passes through it on the way to bills, groceries, subscriptions, mistakes, rent, and all the other little leaks that seem harmless until 12 months pass and you discover the balance never grew into anything meaningful. People still treat these accounts as though the word savings automatically means the money is being cared for. Usually it means the money is sitting still while inflation and temptation take turns eating it. That is why I like a separate high-yield cash account so much it creates distance. Distance from impulse, distance from leakage, distance from your own bad habits. And as a small bonus, it pays you something while it waits. The first interest payments will feel laughably small. That is fine. The point is not that they change your life that month. The point is that they change your understanding. For the first time, cash that would otherwise have lain dormant begins participating. It is no longer merely sitting. It is now doing a tiny amount of work. I still remember what that shift feels like because it is one of the most important moments in a financial life. Even though nobody photographs it, there is no applause. No one is impressed. But internally something changes. You stop thinking of all money as one pile. You begin assigning jobs. Some money is for spending. Some money is for protecting the future. Some money is for compounding. That is the beginning of adulthood in finance. If I were starting over, the high-yield account would have one job above all else: become the emergency fund. 3 months of living expenses at the bare minimum for many people. 6 is better in a more fragile life, maybe more if your income is volatile or your household depends on one earner. I do not worship any exact number, but I absolutely worship the principle. A person without an emergency fund is not an investor. He is a forced seller waiting for a bad week. And forced sellers do not build passive income, they liquidate it. That is why the high yield account matters. It is not the glamorous engine. It is the shock absorber. It keeps a broken water heater, a layoff, a car repair, or a surprise flight from becoming the event that destroys the rest of your system. Once that is taking shape, then I go to the second category, dividend stocks. Now we move from protection to ownership. And this is where I need to say something that sounds obvious but gets lost constantly. A stock is not a line on a screen. A stock is a fractional claim on a real business. That business sells products or services, employs people, makes mistakes, earns profits, pays taxes, allocates capital, and in some cases sends part of those profits back to owners. That last part is the dividend. The dividend is not free money. It is your share of a profitable enterprise SXS cash flow. That is why I have always liked dividend investing when it is done intelligently. It forces people to think in terms of ownership rather than in terms of ticker movement. You stop asking, what can I flip? And start asking, what kind of business can keep sending me cash for decades? That is a much better question, but beginners still make the same mistake over and over. They go hunting for the highest dividend yield as though yield by itself were the whole game. That is how people buy traps. If a yield is screamingly high, you should not feel greedy first. You should feel suspicious first. Sometimes the market is handing you generosity. More often it is warning you that the underlying business is under pressure. The share price has collapsed, or the payout itself is unstable. A healthy dividend stock is not just a big yield. It is a strong business, a sustainable payout, a history of real earnings, and management disciplined enough not to promise cash distributions its economics cannot support. That is what matters. A mature company that keeps making money through many cycles, pays owners regularly, and does not rely on fantasy to justify its valuation is the kind of asset I want in a passive income system. Not because it will make me rich next Thursday, because it teaches the account to generate cash from real enterprise. The beautiful part is that this can start small. 1 share, 3 shares, 10 shares, it does not matter. People underestimate the power of tiny beginnings because they keep confusing scale with direction. If you are currently receiving $0 in passive income, then a $2 dividend is not trivial. It is the first crack in the wall between labor, only life and ownership life, that matters. The first cash payment from a stock does not change your income statement much. It changes your worldview, and worldview is where wealth begins. Now, even though I respect dividend stocks, if I were rebuilding from scratch, I would not stop there. Which brings me to the third category, dividend ETFs. If dividend stocks teach you ownership, dividend ETFs teach you humility. That is a good thing. Most people are not good enough at stock selection, balance sheet analysis, and payout risk assessment to build a concentrated passive income portfolio from individual companies alone. Their ego may hate hearing that. Their portfolio will thank them for hearing it anyway. A dividend ETF gives you diversification. It lets you own a basket of businesses instead of betting your income stream on whether one CEO loses his mind, one industry gets disrupted, or one balance sheet snaps at the wrong moment. That matters enormously. You are not just buying yield, you are buying resilience. The best dividend ETFs do not merely spray high payouts around like confetti. They tend to hold established businesses with profitability, scale, and some history of sending cash back to owners. That makes the income stream less dependent on any one corporate accident. Again, the temptation for beginners is to chase whatever ETF advertises the most intoxicating yield. But the same principle applies here as with individual dividend stocks. If the yield is absurdly high, there is usually a reason. Often that reason is risk hiding inside complexity. Options overlays, leverage less stable underlying assets, a structure that looks generous right up until the day it reveals why it had to bribe you. I do not like being bribed into risk. I do not understand. So if I were starting over, I would prefer strong, broad, sensible dividend ETF exposure over complicated yield gimmicks. What I want is a combination of income and durability. I want the distributions. I also want the asset underneath to have a credible chance of being worth much more in 10 or 20 years. That is the whole magic of good dividend ETF investing. The income can grow, the asset base can grow, the reinvested distributions can buy more productive units. It begins to resemble a well-owned rental property in principle. You collect cash flow now, but you also own something that can appreciate and increase its own income stream over time. That is wealth. Now let me say something people do not like to hear. The early dividends will still feel small. Good. That is not evidence that the strategy is weak. It is evidence that compounding respects time. People who cannot tolerate slow beginnings will never own big endings. This is true in almost everything that matters. The fourth category is bonds or bond funds. Now, the internet has trained younger investors to treat bonds as though they are ancient furniture in someone else's house. That is foolish. Bonds are not there to make your heart race. Bonds are there to do a job. When you buy a bond, you are lending, not owning. That means the potential upside is usually lower than stocks over long periods. Yes, it also means the structure can be much more predictable. You know the coupon, you know the maturity, you know, at least in broad outline, what you are expecting from the arrangement. Predictability is underrated by people who have not yet had enough of life punch them in the mouth. If I were building passive income from scratch, I would not begin with bonds as the dominant engine because I would still be an asset. Building years, equities, and business ownership would matter more for long-run compounding. But I would absolutely respect bonds and bond funds as part of the system because they offer a different type of passive cash flow. They are quieter. They are less romantic. They are also less dependent on the same business upside assumptions that matters in a balanced architecture. A bond fund with good quality exposure can give you monthly or regular income and lower volatility than an all-stock approach. That is useful not just mathematically but psychologically. Passive income is not only about maximizing dollars. It is about building a system you can actually stick with during turbulence. A person whose whole passive income plan lives only in aggressive equity risk is more likely to panic when the market draws blood. A person with some income coming from calmer sources has a better chance of behaving like an adult when the screens turn red. That is a real advantage. Of course, bonds have their own risks. Rates move, credit matters, inflation matters. That is why I do not treat them as magical either. But used properly, they can add a layer of predictability to a passive income system that most people undervalue until they desperately need it. That brings me to the fifth category, REITs. Real estate investment trusts are one of the most useful bridges between people who want real estate, style income, and people who do not want to become part-time plumbers, amateur debt managers, and unwilling therapists for tenants. That sounds flippant. It is not. Direct real estate can be wonderful. It can also become a job wearing an investment costume. REITs let you access parts of the economics of real estate without carrying all the operational headaches yourself. That is valuable. A REIT is essentially a company structure that owns income, producing real estate, and by design distributes a large portion of that income to owners. That means regular cash flow. It also means you can buy into real estate exposure without needing a down payment, a mortgage broker, a contractor, or the patience to explain to someone why the sink clogged is not technically an emergency. I like that. Now, as with everything else, I do not want people to get stupid here. Real estate is not one thing. Apartment REITs, industrial REITs, data center REITs, storage REITs, shopping center REITs, healthcare property REITs, all of these have different economic sensitivities and risks. But the broad point holds, if I were starting over, I would want some exposure to the principle that rent. Like cash flows matter, that real assets matter, and that professional management of diversified properties can be a better answer for many people than buying one little property and praying nothing goes wrong. Again, the yield matters, but not in isolation. Again, the underlying asset quality matters. Again, the income plus asset appreciation combination matters. Notice how often we come back to the same theme, the best passive. Income investments do not merely spit out cash. They also have some chance of becoming more valuable while they do it. That is what people miss when they obsess over the current yield alone. The great game is not just to be paid, it is to be paid by something that also grows. That is why all 5 categories belong in the conversation, even though they do different jobs. High. Yield cash protects. Dividend stocks reward ownership. Dividend ETFs diversify the income machine. Bonds stabilize and smooth. REITs bring in real asset cash flow. That is a system, and systems, unlike fantasies, can be built. Now, I want to say something about starting with INTS and dollars, because this is where people often disconnect from the truth. $1,000 will not let you quit your job. Good. That does not make it irrelevant. $1,000 put to work properly can change your psychology. It can give you your first interest payment, your first dividend, your first tiny proof that capital can move without your hands touching it. The culture mocks small beginnings because it is addicted to visible scale. Wealth mocks the culture by being built through repeated small beginnings almost every time. Your first passive income month may buy you dinner. Wonderful. That dinner was not bought by your hours. It was bought by structure. Do not underestimate how powerful that realization is. Most people underestimate it because they are obsessed with the speed of the result instead of the fact of the result. But the fact is what matters first. Once the fact is established, scale becomes a problem of time, contributions, and patience that is manageable. Now let me warn you about the traps, because passive income talk attracts traps the way sugar attracts ants. The first trap is thinking passive income means no work at the beginning. Wrong. It usually means more work at the beginning because you are building active income, learning, budgeting, and redirecting money that would have been spent carelessly into assets that will not flatter your ego for quite a while. The second trap is confusing yield with safety. We have already talked about this, but it deserves repetition. High yield can be a gift. It can also be a sign that the market is screaming at you while you are busy drooling. The third trap is overcomplicating too early. Do not jump into options because you heard the premium number. Do not build a Frankenstein portfolio because complexity makes you feel advanced. Build the base, then enhance. The fourth trap is inconsistency. Passive income does not reward dabblers. It rewards the mildly stubborn, the kind of person who keeps contributing through boring months, bad months, uncertain months, and months where the result still feels too small to matter. The fifth trap is disrespecting the emergency fund because it is not glamorous. That account is what protects every other account. Without it, your passive income structure is a castle built on wet soil. Now let me zoom out because this is really the part that matters most. What you are building with these 5 categories is not just income. You are building optionality. At first, the optionality is tiny. A bill hurts less. A bad month feels less fatal. A decision can breathe. Later, the optionality grows. You can work fewer hours. You can say no to certain kinds of work. You can invest with less fear because your base is stronger. And if you are persistent enough, there comes a day when your passive income no longer feels symbolic. It becomes a real contributor to your life. That is when work changes from necessity to choice. Not total choice, perhaps. Not immediately. Not in some Instagram fantasy version of freedom, but real choice. And real choice is what wealthy people value most, whether they admit it or not. Passive income, in the adult sense, is not about avoiding effort forever. It is about giving yourself leverage over time. And leverage over time is one of the most beautiful things a person can build. If I were starting over, that is exactly how I would think about it. I would not ask, how do I quit my job next year? I would ask, how do I build a system that makes my job less tyrannical 5, 10, 15 years from now? That is the right question. And if you ask the right question, you stop needing fantasy answers. You begin doing ordinary things with unusual seriousness. You build the reserve. You buy productive assets. You diversify the income. You reinvest. You let time do what it does for the disciplined and withholds from the impatient. That is how the machine gets built. My first passive income payments were small enough that some people would have found them insulting. I found them encouraging. That was the difference. Over time, those little flows became larger ones, then larger still. Eventually, the stream started looking meaningful. Not because I found a trick, because I respected the process before the process respected me back. That is the whole secret. Not brilliance, respect for time, respect for structure, respect for risk, respect for starting too small to feel impressive. If you can do that, then one day you will wake up to the kind of notification that people fantasize about. And the funniest part will be this. It will not feel magical at all. It will feel deserved, because you will know exactly how many boring decisions, how many ignored temptations, how many small monthly transfers, and how many unimpressive early payments it took to get there. That is passive income in the only form that is worth trusting, not a dream, a system. And systems, once they are built properly, can change a life in ways that look very sudden to outsiders and very slow to the person wise enough to build them.